Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? Well, I'm as blessed can be. Today I'm going to be concluding part 2 of the series of messages entitled, Is God a Moral Monster? Now, as many of you might have not noticed, if a person rejects God of the Bible, he often is given an option to label him as immoral. When non-believers have been known to accuse him of being hypocritical, selfish, arrogant, judgmental, hateful, homicidal, insensitive, or being rude. You know, all these words that are a variation of a moral monster. When fortunately he isn't. Now, in my previous series of messages, I have asked one question along with two statements about the series of messages itself. The first one I have asked you was this question: is God evil? And like I said, the first problem is with any moral monster accusation against him is that it requires a standard of morality that is separated from him. And what I'm trying to say is God is morally wrong. One has to define morality in a way that justifies this claim. But what's meaningful that can exist is, other than God, for moral principles. Apart from him, it is absolutely impossible to have truly objective morality. Opinion isn't enough for the claim God is a moral monster to be meaningful. It has to be based on some unchanging standard. Ideas such as suffering or human flourishing, those are not objective. There's no rational reason for opinions or subjective ideas to be the source of moral reasoning. And the first problem, as I said, was that God is immoral, meaning that moral claims require God to exist in the first place. Labeling anything either good or evil requires assumption that leads inevitably to the God. This is related to the next common objection about divine morality. The second one I told you about is the problem of good. And then I said non-believers often accuse God of still being evil. More often than not, however, they indirectly attack God's morality for questioning the existence of evil. A truly good God, they claim, would not allow evil. Now, we all know this follows into a stickler problem. Why ought to be very good if there is no God? Or if a God is truly a moral monster. As I said, if the ultimate measure of morality in some human opinion, then there can always be different ways to interpret that opinion. Human flourishing sounds like a great basis for morality until somebody conveniently defines certain people as less as humans. And then, this which leads really into the major instance of hypocrisy. In claiming that God is morally wrong, people are claiming more than the knowledge of a better moral system. They're claiming to be the standards of morality. That claim not only makes the criticism of God's moral less impactful, but however, it's meaningless though. And then the last thing I have told you about was, you're not the boss of me. And here's what I said. Listen to what I said. This is the third common accusation, is that God, as I said from the very beginning, or more than 5 times, is that he himself is arrogant, selfish, insensitive, economical. When God demands worship, he would be the reason he punished those who do not agree, and even condemns those who insult him. and a common line of complaint, a truly good God will allow people to do as they please without necessarily obeying his rules, and he obviously would not care how they think or speak of him. The fastest response to this particular objection is based on the concept of parenting. Good parents don't allow their children to insult or disobey him, obviously. This isn't because parents are insensitive or egomaniacs. No. It's not about those. It's about them, the parents I'm talking about. They love their children the same way mentors, surrogate parents, and their teachers love everybody in real life. And like I said, they must learn how to love their own children and the young people after the kids had taught the same way their parents had been taught the same way their children would love everybody first. And that's all there was to it. And not only that, the accusations of divine arrogance and selfishness also have to be put in perspective. The reason people have a problem with human arrogance and egotism is simple. We know the egotist isn't perfect. When a person's arrogance grates on our nerves because on our basic knowledge that is the egomaniac isn't actually perfect. He doesn't have that much to be arrogant about. When God is perfect, if he speaks, acts, and rules as though he is perfect, it's simply because he is. There's no arrogance or selfishness or insensitivity involved, as there would be in a lesser being God claims of glory match reality. And even furthermore, according to the Bible, God has demonstrated great patience, love, and sacrifice on behalf of humanity. The core concept of the gospel is that God was willing to become a human being, suffer and struggle, then be killed by his own creations. He did all of this in order to provide the means to allow mankind to live forever with him. That's far from, get this, selfish, arrogant, insensitive, irresponsible, and egotist. Next, I want to talk to you about life, death, and war as I follow up on the three that I have already given you so far. Please listen. Many who accuse God of being the moral monster mention the wars described in the Old Testament, or they indicate to use the capital punishment for certain acts under the Mosaic law. The simplest response to these arguments has the advantage of logical strength, although it means little to the average unbeliever. Okay? Simply put, if God exists and created life, then he has the authority to decide what happens to that life. He can set the rules if he pleases, and he can determine the punishments for breaking those rules if he pleases. If the entire universe is his creation, then morality, including life and death, is by definition under his control. Another response to this story is to the charge that events in the Old Testament are morally reprehensible, is to place each and every one of those events in their historical and scriptural context. When God commanded war against the Canaanites, for instance, it was not some random act of genocide. This was a culture that had been warned about the pervasive evil for centuries, and the time for God to punish that evil had finally come. Please mark Genesis 15:16. When I am done reading it, go get your Bible, turn to the scripture I have already given you, read it, and put in it and paraphrase it, and tell me what you think about this two-part series of messages. Oh, but there is more, all right. I'm not done yet. When God commanded the death penalty in Israel for certain offenses, it was not in the context of a stable, free, modern environment. It was during a time of great danger, instability, and uncertainty. The same principle applies even in modern societies. We punish crimes in proportion to their damage to the culture in that day and time. What today would be considered minor crimes, if crimes at all, were profound, damaging to the survival of the culture. Once again, the context of God's commands is important. If God's plan was to bring the Messiah, the one and only hope of mankind, through Israel, then it's reasonable that he would take serious measures to protect the survival of that nation. Bottom line. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about, and this is actually the last one, this is the second to last one, it's all about free will versus suffering and evil. And here's why. Easily the most common attack on God's morality is the reality of evil, of course. According to the accusation, God is a moral monster since he created evil, or because he neglects to do anything above evil. Both claims are contrary to reason and evidence, as well as the Bible understanding of God's nature. In the simplest words or phrases, evil is anything that contradicts the will of God. There is an absolute difference then between something that God cannot and does not will, but that he allows, and that which he directly and purposefully causes to occur. If it's logically possible for a fallible human being to allow certain things, if you will, which he could theoretically prevent in order to obtain some greater goals, then God can absolutely do the same. This is where the concept of free will enters the equation. Now, the overwhelming majority of human suffering is the result of human activity. More often than not, it is the result of human sin, either our own or somebody else's. But without the ability to choose selfishness, cowardice, and revenge, there would be no such thing as the three words: generosity, bravery, or forgiveness. Love expressed by being given no option when to love is hollow. Worship from such a being is meaningless. Okay, it is absolutely false to suggest that God has done absolutely nothing about evil. Everyone knows that. I know that. And you folks at home know it too. Scripturally, there are many reasons to think that God has limited the level of evil we are capable of experiencing on earth. Mark Job 1:12 and 2:6. With 2 Thessalonians 2:7. Regardless of whatever boundary God sets for the evil, there will always be the worst possible thing. The error is in assuming that God hasn't set the bar for suffering lower than he could have. Likewise, according to the Bible, God has gone to great lengths to enact a plan to end all suffering and evil. More to the point is that God's plan has not been completed. Not yet. It's not even logically a sign that God has done nothing. The end result has not yet occurred when everything is in motion towards that end. Though the subject of human free will is complicated, especially a brief examination indicates that there are reasons, at least in theory, why God would allow us freedom and choice in this life that we are living in. Well, that's absolutely true when one thinks that, according to Christianity, this life is not all there is. What we struggle with and suffer under in this life is not all we are or all we ever meant for. And finally, while this is rarely an in-depth look at the claim that God is described as the moral monster, it ought to be enough to demonstrate that the claim is absolutely harder to prove than some might think. There are several facts, philosophical and logical flaws in making such an accusation against God. I enjoyed this series of messages for 2 weeks. And what I have learned was, God is really such a very special human being. He does not look at it at fault. No. He is not an insensitive God. No. He is not an abrasive God. He is the almighty yet powerful God whom you always need to listen to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if you have a problem that is either not big or not that small, you come to him and he will solve it, and you will be truly amazed. He will do it all for you. Well, I thank you very much for watching. You take it easy, and I will see you again next week. Oh, and by the way, believe it or not, if I would take a look at my calendar, well, I don't need to take a look at my calendar because what I know for a fact is we are getting closer to daylight savings time, on which we are only 12 days away. That's why we are heading into March. But that doesn't mean winter is over yet. You just have to get past another obstacle. There will be some rain, there will be some snow, there will be cold weather, and everything else. But the bottom line is you just dress warm, especially when we're getting some daylight in the next 2 weeks of Sunday. And most importantly, you have to set your clock forward, okay? Forward, that's right. Like you've heard the phrase, spring forward, fall back. Always set your clock forward, because everybody will be able to understand you. You might want to think as to what all the others are doing when they're in their homes, sending their clocks forward 1 hour from the appropriate time, and so forth. Thank you. Goodbye.